And we'll still just shoot the breeze for a moment or two as
Sounds
we're
good.
saying hi to folks coming in. Although it looks like we have 6 so far, so that's always nice.
Oh, it's 11 on my screen. Yikes.
Oh
I'm
wow!
jumping up.
Oh wow! Dang! Oh, mine might not count me, but
Hmm.
yeah, who knows? Good to see you, friends. Happy Friday. Happy St. Patrick's Day for those that enjoy
Green
any
March Band.
any part. Yeah, I have a lot of green on. Um, not doing corned beef today though, because it's also Lent. So we're
Yeah.
doing. I was telling Stefan we're doing fish tacos tonight. Um, they're going to be great. I'm very excited for them. So it's good to see folks. But yeah, a lot of years. I actually during the pandemic, the shutdown in 2020 happened like right around St. Patrick's Day because I remember I was gonna like go and get a corned beef, and then
Ah,
everything was closed down, and so I ended up having to do something totally different.
yeah.
And I'm a big fan when I can do it well. But we have a local place that makes really good ones, so I like to get it from there, and then just crock pot like all day, or sous vide for forever, and then it's just like falling apart and perfect. But
Yeah.
yeah, we're gonna do fish tonight. It's gonna be great. But yeah, if you uh, I don't know, green beer. That's like I'm not.
Green
I don't drink
beer.
beer, so like, never been a favorite of mine. So the idea of tinting it further like does not add to the appeal for me. But
No.
uh, the parades can be fun, you know. But yeah, it's I've always taken, I guess, more of a I just want to have like a nice meal at home kind of thing. My family definitely didn't ever do the parades growing up. We're not like Irish, we're Slovenian, so
Right.
so that's like not a thing. But we have actually a pretty big Irish Catholic population in the Cleveland area, so that is something that like I grew up with a lot of people that did like Irish dance and stuff.
Cool.
I forgot to do it. I asked my Final Fantasy Discord. I wanted to find a like an OC remix of something from FF10, but done in like an Irish style.
Ah, yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
maybe we'll pull up they did send me a couple videos, so maybe we'll have to pull those up because they were really fun, or at least I'll link them in the chat because
Yeah.
we may not be able to listen to very much today. I'm a little concerned about copyright strikes
Yes.
on
Yeah.
concert versions specifically, in a way that when it's gameplay it tends to not be as targeted, shall we say. So
Yes.
we will
Yeah.
tell you about where to find these things, but I was looking, I was trying to even find like some kind of a preview of the concerto, like the sheet music.
Oh
And
no.
no,
Oh,
and I figured
we
that
can
was
talk
super
about that.
proprietary, so all
We
I
can
could
talk
find
about
were
that.
other people transcribing tracks from 10.
Hmm.
um yeah. Oh yeah, I'd love to hear about everyone's various St. Patrick's Day shenanigans. The prize for most hilarious uplift today: flat cap and orange jumper.
Nice.
Nice. I love it. Yeah, so welcome, Stefan, to the stream.
Hello. Hi.
You've been on in your capacity as chair of the AMS Ludomusicology study group, but I believe this is the first time we've had you on, just you and me, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Awesome.
Part of it is this is my only thing published right now, so lots of things that are in press, but are not actually out yet. So
Yeah. And you were very judicious about your publications, protecting your time with your dissertating. So I will just let everyone know. For the animation book, we asked Stefan to write a chapter for us on Kingdom Hearts. And we were turned down. And then we asked Ryan. We said, well, maybe Ryan Thompson can do it. And Ryan said, absolutely not. You have to ask Stefan. I was like, we did. That's the problem.
yeah.
So I know that Ryan definitely feels a debt to your chapter, and has said how the stuff that you shared to sort of help him get that chapter written.
Yeah.
But I was like, you know what? That's great. We got to normalize. There's that pressure when you're dissertating, and then you're like, oh, I'm starting to get opportunities because I have friends in the field, and I want to say yes to everything, but also I got to write this dissertation. I got to get it done.
Yeah.
And then going on the market, it's like you feel like you have to have stuff in progress, that it's like the dissertation isn't enough for a lot of us, right?
Yeah.
So I'm guessing
Yeah.
that balance was real fun for you.
Yeah, like it was chaotic. I did end up taking a few. invited chapters and things, but or actually, let me phrase that, all of them, I knew I could somehow incorporate into the dissertation. So it was a matter of saying, like, this will be in the dissertation regardless, in some kind of way at least. And so I'm not wasting time. Is like, I don't like saying it in those kind of way, or saying it in that kind of way, but just having it not eating up from the dissertation research time. So it's kind of, taking my time, or being careful with my time, as you said.
Everything I published during my process was like one-offs that had nothing to do with my dissertation, because in my head it was like I was like keeping the dissertation for myself, which I think will help in kind of turning it into a book, which is the current very slow-moving project. It's been a slow-moving project since 2018. I have good ideas. I just move slowly on it because pandemic, executive functioning, having a toddler.
Yes.
All of that. So eventually. Yes, we're talking about free time in air quotes. But I admire the balance that you struck there.
Thank you.
So this one is for the Uematsu volume, which we are kind of spending the month with. Oh, I forgot to put the front page in. Darn it. I have to pop it in, but Andrew scanned it for me, so I had the front page. Anyway, that's why it's blank on the right side. You know, I normally put the front page up so you can see what it looks like. You'll just have to imagine what it looks like or get the book. So this is Uematsu's Postgame, the music of Final Fantasy in the concert hall and beyond, in the music of Nobuo Uematsu in the Final Fantasy series, edited by Rich Anatone. You can see from the page numbers, this is a honkin' big book. Massive tome. So if you like Final Fantasy, boy, is that a book for you. Just came out in August, I think, of last year, and has a really cool cover design. I'm a big fan. And so tell me a little bit about how this one came to be. You know, did Rich just reach out and say, hey, concerts?
Yeah. Well, so not concerts, actually. Rich did reach out to me 2017 or 18, I think. Probably 2018, actually. And was like, hey, I found your master's thesis on, academia.edu, read it, and would really like to, include your research in this book that I'm proposing. I was like, oh. And I had never met Rich before, so this was just like totally out of the blue. And I was like, maybe, can you tell me like a little bit more? And so we talked about it. I was like, yeah, I think I could do something about that. And I was like, well, can I, maybe adapt my master's thesis into a chapter? And he's like, well, I'd probably like something new for the book. I was like, that's fair enough. And by this point, I was already toying with the idea of focusing on classical concert arrangements and concerts for the dissertation. So I was like, well, maybe I can use this as a kind of soft start for that, right? And just start thinking about it, start reading stuff that's out there, figuring it out, I guess, kind of as we go along, or as I go along. And so that was that. It was a good process overall. The peer review was peer reviewed, which was nice as well. Mm-hmm. They liked it for the most part. They gave me some comments. One of the more interesting ones, and maybe we'll get to this, is I had a very different understanding of prog rock, because I come at it from a contemporary understanding of prog rock than prog rock from the 70s, essentially.
Sure.
Which is what Uematsu listens to frequently, and it's kind of like his music of choice, right? So I was like, oh yeah, like classical music or classical instruments, right? You're not really going to hear that in rock music. And they're like, well, actually, yes, you would.
Yeah.
In prog rock. So I had to go read up on prog rock, which was fun. But
it wasn't listen to some like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and like
yeah, and Tarkus in particular. I have to thank Tom, who's a Japanese professor at Northwestern. We had a conversation, and actually, if you go to the acknowledgments in the book, I acknowledge him in there. He's like, oh yeah, and then like Dancing Mat, the last section is just Tarkus, basically from ELP. I was like, what? So I go and listen to it. It's like, oh no, yeah, that is almost that is that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So hearing and like learning all these things, just going through the process was super interesting and super fun, and super eye-opening, I guess I might also say.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. I love hearing about, stuff that's really far beyond like your scope and then pushes you in a bit of a new direction.
Yeah,
That's so good.
yeah.
So I'm glad to hear it went well, and then served as so this was written kind of as you were getting your proposal together, like sort of in that phase.
Yeah, yeah. So, probably even a little bit before I officially submitted like the prospectus or anything like that. The edits and all that were ongoing pretty much through the PhD.
Mm-hmm.
But the first draft, at least, I think was done. I can even check maybe. I think was done by 2020 or so. Let's see if I can find that real quick. Da, 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 da. And I was, presenting on it in various capacities, just trying to get feedback on it, right? And say like, what do I need to add? What sorts
Mm-hmm.
of things are people buying or not? All that good stuff. So yeah, so the proposal I sent in was in 2018, and my first draft, 2019. Yeah. So
So that like folks doing the math here, like that just shows you academic publishing uh,
yep.
can move pretty slow, and sometimes books are slower, but not always. I know folks that have had things sitting like awaiting peer review at journals, and maybe they just haven't found the right people to review something, and then it can kind
Yeah.
of languish. I feel like if Karen's still here in the chat, I feel like Karen had one that was sitting in a journal awaiting feedback for like years. So this does happen, not
Yeah.
just in books, but it's it's why sometimes when I have students asking, "Oh, is there anything published on XYZ?" and maybe I say, "Oh, well, there was a conference paper," but that could be years, and or the person may not decide to turn that into something, or they might hold on to it until the right opportunity comes along. So, yeah, I'm trying to remember. I don't remember what it was, but I feel like I remember you. Oh, still not out. Yeah. So
Oh,
there you
wow.
go. Yeah, it's been languishing for, or maybe not languishing, but awaiting,
Yeah.
awaiting some feedback. Yeah,
Purgatory.
yeah, and that can feel interminable, and then you want to reach out and be like, so what's happening? But you don't want to be too pushy either. So it
Yeah.
can be kind of an interesting dance, especially at a journal if like the editors change over and then you're like, okay, what happened to my to my
Right.
article?
Yeah.
So it can move pretty slow. And then some things it seems like it's almost instant. So it's just there's no telling. Yeah, it's been years. Maybe next month. Oh, I can't wait. I can't wait.
Yeah.
So it's a process. But hopefully a good one. And, with everybody involved enjoying what we're doing. So, uh, you open right with one of my big uh, flags that I carry around, right?
Yes.
So we have these Final Fantasy concert musics, and we know that they're very popular. They're still some of these concert series are still running, but even like one-off arrangement albums, there's just a lot of versions of Final Fantasy music that are not just the originally encoded game sound. And ever since, there is discourse from some of the fans to the extent to which concert versions of the Final Fantasy music might represent like an intended or idealized version, sort of the sounds that Uematsu was hearing in his head while composing, like this kind of realization of what the technology couldn't render. And of course, I get up on my soapbox and shake my fist at the clouds at that, right?
Yeah.
Because I think we're very much like writing for the idiom, and it doesn't mean that like, you can't imagine a symphonic sound in that medium, but I think most of the time, who today is sitting there being like, "Oh, my DAW. If only it could do X, Y, Z."
Right.
I don't know. I just feel like you're so excited to exploit like the new things and figure out like workarounds and like interesting ways to create the sounds you want. So I just wonder to what extent anyone is sitting there like lamenting. I don't know. it's not like it never happens. There are definitely people that describe running into limitations when they were coming into encoding, but for the most part, I'm in that Will Cheng camp of like being very attached to the actual sounds, including the opera.
Mm-hmm.
Why should I want that to an actual performance by a singer? I don't know. It's a really powerful thing, those timbres. So anyway, it's a question of, how much, especially the intention gets complicated when Uematsu himself is involved in creating these concert versions, right? Because then everyone's like, oh, well, clearly this is how he heard it originally.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so here's another thing. So again, in the acknowledgement section, you might see that I acknowledge Eric Roth and Benjamin Noose as well. So Eric Roth is Arnie Roth's son. So Arnie Roth is the conductor for pretty much all the Final Fantasy concerts, but especially Distant Worlds, right? And so Eric Roth is his son and runs the spin-off, I guess you could say, A New World Chambers series, which does Final Fantasy music as well. I was able to interview him and Benjamin, who's the pianist for, again, a lot of the Final Fantasy things, when they were in Chicago in 2020. And one of the questions I asked him was like, do you have any insight on this? Like, has he, him being Uematsu, has Uematsu ever mentioned to you all this kind of, I was thinking this or I was not? And they're like, not really. So it really is this kind of floatiness of, and that doesn't mean that he's not thinking about it either, but it shouldn't be assumed, I guess, is kind of like the larger point, right?
Yeah.
There are certain stylizations, right? So I guess that was before the stream started. We were talking about the prog rock bit, or no, that was after the prog rock bit, though. And just like how prog rock has influenced him. And so thinking of like the Hammond organ or something like that as maybe a particular timbre or like one sound, but not necessarily saying that everything is alluding to these kind of classical instrumentations, right?
Yeah. And then also, I guess I wouldn't mind the idea of like intention or some kind of a realization on real instruments argument if it weren't so often coupled with this idea of it being better by default or being a replacement for the original experience, because then of course that gets tied up a lot in like our memory and our player agency and our the affect, all the stuff Julianne works on, right?
Yeah.
That's where I run into issues with it, like some of these beautiful projects of like uncovering the original sources of samples from some of these games uncompressed and then saying, well, this is how it should have said. It's like, no, it's
yeah.
I love those projects when they don't take that extra leap, when they're just like, look how cool this is, we found the sources,
Yeah.
Not that going to the next clickbaity. And speaking of clickbait, Uematsu gets called the Beethoven of video game music.
Yes.
All the time, the kind of classic FM ways of describing Uematsu. And we know Will Gibbons has talked about the whole Beethoven of video game music thing, right? We know this is a particular hornet buzzing around Will Gibbons' ear here. Uematsu often uses the trappings of classical music and the instrumentation, so like it's not only a clickbait thing, it's that there is a recognition that there is an alignment here with some classicalisms, and so that it's useful to explore it, just as it's also useful to explore the prog rock side of things. So it gives us a nice insight into Uematsu's process. Of course, you come back to this at the end and kind of separate them back out in some really fruitful ways. But importantly, as you and Will have both talked about, that we have a lot of cultural capital associated with classical things. And so this contributes to this, but then you're very interested in how Uematsu was sort of grabbing some of this cultural capital right from the beginning of the process, as early as 1989. So 2 years after Final Fantasy came out, we were already having concertizations in Japan.
Yeah.
So this sets the stage for Uematsu to explicitly garner cultural capital, but also to gather it at perhaps an accelerated rate. Will is the Uematsu of Beethoven discourse in VGM. Oh goodness, who's the Beethoven of Uematsu discourse?
Oh gosh.
Will Chang, maybe? I don't know. Hard to say. There's a lot of candidates in this new book, so it's like it's the whole book is about him. So
So maybe Rich then, right?
yeah,
You're the
maybe
one that asked the
Rich.
question, but you're the one that put the book together.
Yeah, yeah. So here's the kind of walkthrough, always cued by some kind of this chapter.
Yeah.
Although some folks get around to using that exact phrasing, but when they do, it makes my life easier. So
Yeah.
you write, this chapter examines the movement of Uematsu's Final Fantasy scores from their ludic origins to their various licensed adaptations and arrangements for the concert hall and beyond. From the 1989 Final Fantasy Symphonic Suite to the more recent Final Symphony concerts, 2013 and 2015, from the long-running Distant Worlds concert series, 2007 to the present, to various non-soundtrack albums released that feature arrangements of the music from the series. While this chapter begins with a historical overview of these out-of-game arrangements, it continues on to examine the motivations for bringing the music outside of the games in the first place. And here we're drawing from the musical philosophical writings of Peter Zendi,
Hmm. Zendi.
Zendi,
Yeah.
on musical arrangements and transcriptions. My case studies examine two of the various strategies used to arrange this music, which was, at least initially, not recorded with acoustic orchestral instruments. The first strategy arrangement, these are always long. The first strategy arrangement is based on freely adapting the music from the games into, quote, proper classical forms. So Masashi Hamauzu's Final Fantasy X Piano Concerto arranged from various pieces from Final Fantasy X from 2001. And the second strategy, transcription, keeps much of the music the same, but focuses instead on changing timbre, orchestration, or genre. There's going to be some examples from Dancing Mad to fit everything from a solo piano transcription to the Black Mage's prog rock instrumentation. I conclude with a reflection on Uematsu's placement within the video game music canon. There you go.
A mouthful.
But clear. That's the best. That's the best thing. Sometimes it takes a bit of a paragraph to really walk us through what's going to happen. So
Yeah.
I think a hefty walkthrough is an asset. So there's kind of two things at play here: video game music concerts, even the ones that don't involve Uematsu, and then Final Fantasy series concerts of the series specifically. And here you cite Elizabeth Hunt, who has worked on kind of all of video game music concert history.
Yeah, so all of video game music concert history, but she's also working on film and TV concert stagings as well in her current work. So she just multimedia stagings of concert stagings of multimedia works, I think, just kind of writ large. But her master's thesis, which is what I'm drawing from here, was particularly looking at video game music concerts, and just really, really great. I've been telling everybody, like, if you're interested in this, read her master's dissertation, because it's phenomenal. So yeah.
So the very first one is Koichi Sugiyama's music for Dragon Quest at the Family Classic Concert, which was in Tokyo in 1987, which, like, the game had, like, just come out, right? My goodness.
Yeah.
Like, ink was barely dry. That's not the right. Dry on the label for the cartridge, maybe.
Right. Yeah.
And we're already, like, turning these into concerts. That's a pretty significant thing to think about. And I imagine Elizabeth spends some time on that in the thesis dissertation. And so 87, 2 years later, we have Final Fantasy Symphonic Suite, which was just a single concert, one-off performance, but then they released it on CD with the music from the first Final Fantasy games at the time, the first two. That ends up being an important piece here, that the Uematsu concerts tended to always sort of coincide with a CD release, at least early on. I guess they still do have how many albums of Distant Worlds, like 5 or 6 now?
Yeah, it's 5. Actually, so it depends if you count, so Distant Worlds Choral, so it's the 35th anniversary, right? Choral being 35th anniversary wedding, whatever. They released a CD of that as well, so I think that's a live one. Granted, I think the first Distant Worlds was also a live one, so this is maybe 6, but not actually called 6. It's like Distant Worlds Choral or whatever. I don't actually have it yet, so I have not listened to it, but yeah.
Well, and after we were playing Theater Rhythm a couple weeks ago, there was that really good string quartet arrangement. I don't even remember what the piece was, but I was like, this is amazing. And
Yeah.
then Ryan and Julianne were like, oh yeah, there's like a new album and like it's for pre-order. It's not out yet, but
Yeah.
um, so like that's not counting those types of things, those kind of arrangement
Right.
albums. These are just of the concerts themselves.
Yes.
There's always been this tie-in to CD, so we're kind of like commodifying the music, so it's not only about the live touring. You have this opportunity to get it in more hands and have it heard by a broader audience, and that's a big piece of this. Because then there's kind of that ubiquity almost lends a sense of like prestige, you know, like oh
Yeah.
everybody's heard of this
Yeah.
kind of thing.
I mean, it's the media mix and play, which I didn't have this language back then, but that's what it is.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Keep clicking over to chat and then not able to advance my PowerPoint here.
Good.
So the timing is important, that these things were entering the canon early. Not only the video game music canon, but starting to kind of position itself as concert music. And I'm interested, does Elizabeth, and I know it may be a while since you've read the work, but does Elizabeth talk about like film music concerts kind of alongside? And sort of, or maybe Andrew can speak to this in the chat if you know much about sort of the history of these play along with the movie. I feel like that's a more recent phenomenon, but
It
the idea of
is.
legitimizing the music in the concert hall is a little older.
Yeah, so I mean, it is. So yeah, it has a longer history. So Korngold actually has arrangements of some of his work, and he arranged them into kind of like concert pieces. This was something I was interested in maybe pursuing, but didn't. But the play-alongs in particular, so Brooke McCorkle Okazaki now has written at least 2 articles on this, and kind of tracing the production of these cine concerts where the screen is behind the orchestra in particular, and the orchestra is playing along with the music, which is slightly different than some of the other strategies for doing this. But like Emilio Odesino and Frank Lehman have also written on this phenomenon kind of writ large.
Oh, there you go. And Andrew's
Yeah,
saying,
and
yeah,
Andrew, yeah.
turning them into suites. And I, even thinking about in the '90s, the awareness I had of soundtrack albums of films, and how many people were like, "Oh, I love getting soundtracks to these kind of orchestral
Yeah.
films, and not just the kind of I getting a pop music licensed, like a romantic comedy that would have more
Yeah.
of that. That we're kind of gesturing towards certain types of film music in that market. Fun story about those play along concerts. I actually, when I met Joe, I have a cat here. Hello. When I met Joe, and we were kind of running into each other a lot, and then he finally decided to ask me on a date. He asked me to go to a lecture at the planetarium, like at the Natural History Museum, which is reading the room pretty well. I like that kind of nerdy, like, let's go learn something.
Yeah.
And I said yes, and then I checked the date, and I was like, I have tickets to see the Cleveland Orchestra do Back to the Future. And I was like, and you don't know me, but that's like a big movie in my life.
Yeah.
And I was taking a friend of mine, and I was like, yeah, I'm not gonna bail on her. So I was like, maybe another night. And so I like went to the bathroom. He had to like come up with something else. And
Oh,
so by
wow.
the time I had like come back to the table, he was just like, okay, so the art museum is doing a Monet exhibit. Maybe we could do that and get dinner. And so Joe did not get to go on his original first date with me because of Back to the Future. So
Good.
it was great. They added, Silvestri had extra music that isn't in the original to like fill it out even more. It's always cool to see how orchestras do that, and to have like the Cleveland Orchestra do it. It was like unbelievable.
Yeah.
But anyway, this is happening with video games too, as anyone who's seen some of these can attest. There are ones that shoe the screens completely and make it very like this is a classical concert. But I think increasingly we're seeing the kind of mixed media element to sort of bring the memory of the game back for people as they're hearing this new version of it.
Oh, yeah.
So even in the early 90s, we're getting music performed in these orchestral game music concerts, which are not just Uematsu's music, but it's this idea of he's being included among the other composers that are kind of considered the great orchestral game music, right? So canonizing is
orchestral.
happening. And how much of canonizing is just, somebody choosing to play the music again and again.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
that's how repertoires get formed. And that's why when I always have students asking me about like how stuff becomes canonized, this over that. And, isn't it on some level based on merit? And I'm like, yeah, sometimes. I mean, like, there's like not great Beethoven pieces. Like I don't see Wellington's Victory getting like performed all the time, right? There's Beethoven that we play and Beethoven we don't play as much.
Yes.
But I point out it takes work. Somebody
Yeah.
like Doug Shadle working on Florence Price, but then just having like good writing about it, you also need to get it in the hands of musicians. So then you need a score that isn't just a manuscript, because a lot of performers don't want to read from a manuscript version, and try to figure out like what note is that if the handwriting's not quite
Yeah.
good. So it's like you need an edited version and like all these things to kind of make it accessible so that people can start programming it, and then it can kind of have this revolution where it can kind of enter the canon in a new way. So this is all to say, like, if you ever feel like your work it makes no difference, it can. This is how this happens. It's slow. It can be very slow, but this is something we can do to help sort of broaden the canons. So
Yeah.
not that there's anything wrong with the music in the canons most of the time.
Most of the time.
Most of the time. So it's more about the process of getting stuff into the canons that can be very messed up, right?
Yeah.
And exclusionary and kind of by default. Hearing just reading all of these. Disney makes a mint on schools bringing their bands down to play along with the movies. Yeah, I bet. I absolutely can see that happening. Heck, even High School Musicals, like the cost of renting the music in the book for
Oh, for the actual musical, yeah.
Yeah, for just anything. It's pretty astonishing. And then you'll only get it for like 6 weeks. So that's not even tenable for some school orchestras, because the kids can like barely learn the music in that time. So depending on what the show is, I think the terms can be longer for how long, if it's like Brigadoon and it's like an old show, I think you can get it for longer. But if you're trying to do something that's more recent, sometimes you're getting it like with no time. That happened. I had to orchestrate Mamma Mia with 6 weeks notice. A few years ago, like right after my dissertation. That was like one of my first big freelance projects. And I was like, as soon as I finished it, they were like giving the parts out. So it was a process.
Yeah.
But anyway, concertization. So we already said it's important that these things were being recorded and released on CD. It's turning them into these artifacts, kind of imbuing them with some kind of, I don't know, mystic energy.
I mean, they become a memento is ultimately what it is in my mind. So James DeVille writes about this with Liszt scores, actually, back in the day. So that's what I kind of compare it to. But it's not even necessarily that you're buying it to listen to. Like you probably will at some level, but it's more just like having this thing, which then tethers that memory to this event that you go to, right? So mementos is how I think about them.
Yeah. And you think about like, what would you have Uematsu sign if you met him at a concert? Like a lot of people are going to bring these CDs. They might bring a copy of the game itself. So this ends up being kind of a competitor for the signature.
Or you could be me, and so when you meet Yoko Taro for the Nier concert, you bring a copy of the game, you bring a copy of the soundtrack, and then you also bring a copy of Distant World CD because Arnie is there because he was the conductor, and so you have different people signing different things if you're really nerdy like me.
Really planning, yeah.
Yes.
When NACFGM 5 at Michigan, Marty O'Donnell was the keynote.
Yeah.
And Joe came with me to that one, and he brought Halo. And
Perfect.
so we have a signed Marty O'Donnell Halo in our house, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
I didn't get anything signed. The only like major like nerd moment I had like that was when I met Takashi Tateishi at MagFest, and there had been like a 6-hour meet and greet for him, and so I didn't get in line, and I was kind of bummed about it. But then I saw him in the hallway just like randomly, and I just like he didn't look like I shouldn't approach him. Like he wasn't giving off that air. So I like very cautiously like just told him I loved his music since I was a little girl, and he's like, "Do you want to take a picture?" I was like, Yeah, and I look so like stupid in the picture because I'm just like I am just overjoyed,
Yeah.
standing there, and he's like, "Let's do a thumbs up." It's like this is the coolest thing ever.
I mean, those are the best kind of pictures, though. Like maybe sometimes you're like, I wish it could have been better, better. But it's like the memory, right?
Yeah, you're like, I
The
wish I
memory
would
is
have looked
like,
better, but at the same time, like you can see how excited I am,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
how I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily know his face either,
Mhm.
because like a lot of these names, I wouldn't know the faces for. So
Yeah,
yeah, that was a pretty cool moment. But I definitely didn't have anything to like to be signed. Nor do I think that would have been the right like time or move at that moment when I
yeah,
just ran into him in the hallway. But it was cool to get a picture.
yeah,
So these artifacts, they're pretty powerful, and even just the act of recording. I tell everyone like my career was kind of started when I used to hold my Walkman up to the TV speakers and record the Final Fantasy soundtracks. I'd go into an area, like stop playing, hold it up, try to get a complete loop or two. And
yeah,
then I had these cassettes of the entire soundtrack because back then it was like you kind of had a bootleg to get OSTs in this country. And I didn't really know much about that until I was older. So when I'm 10, 11, that was how I was getting game soundtracks. And like those
yeah.
objects are really special
Hmm.
for all of their like poor, hitting record and having weird clicks and
Yeah,
pauses and but I used to listen through those
yeah.
and adore them. So and that was my access to it. So I totally get it. I get the artifact component here.
Hmm.
Dear Friends in 2004 was the first time that these concerts moved outside of Japan. And this is where Arnie Roth enters the picture. Starts with this and then goes on to lead Distant Worlds, which begins in 2007. And it was on the 25th anniversary. So it's also when Theater Rhythm came out. Synergy with the previous chapters
I
here.
think Theater Rhythm was the next anniversary, big anniversary. I could be wrong.
I thought she said it was 25th.
It may have been I could be wrong. I don't actually know for sure. So,
Go back to my VOD, everyone.
yeah,
Not right now.
rewatch.
I could swear it was 2007, and then there was the curtain call, which was maybe the 30th. I don't
That
know,
might be it then, actually.
something
Yeah.
like that. Like they tried to make them line up with, and of course the new one.
Hmm.
What is it? 35th now.
35th now. Yeah.
Yeah. So this one coming out for the 35th. So yeah, and there've now been 5 of these albums, and these, unlike just having a concert, classical concert style, these are now where we have the full audio visual game footage being on the screens behind the orchestra, and that sense of kind of like accompanying the action. Although in some ways, I get the sense that these are a little bit less futzy with the timing, as opposed to playing the film. Because when I have had friends do those film concerts, they have the original in their ear and they're watching the conductor who has a timed score that's playing with the film. And it's all about like trying to keep it exactly there.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's a lot more of just kind of montagey game footage.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the concert. So for Distant Worlds, the ones that I've seen at least, Arnie doesn't use a click. So it is
Hmm.
more freeform. Like obviously he tries to time it to everything. But for like the Pokemon one that I went to, that one she just flat out had a click. And you could even I think you'd see the pulsing light
Yeah.
on the stand. So I mean, it really depends on what the conductor and or more likely the concert producers
Yeah.
want from it, right?
Yeah, I know musicians find that incredibly stressful because it's hard to have something else in your ear.
Yeah,
Um, Click isn't as bad, but anything but a click. And from what I have heard, a lot of times the film stuff you are getting piped in either the part or just the full score to kind of keep up
yeah,
with. Um, and yeah, it does kind of constrain them to playing it exactly like the original versus this more, having a little bit of room for the conductor to shape things in real time and also, take into account that you're responding to the audience and like the energy
yeah.
can change in different spaces and you can get these kind of unique versions of the music every time.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard some conductors even talk about how when they're doing these concerts, they might want to slow down a little bit to make sure that the orchestra is getting all the notes and everything, but then the orchestra says, no, this isn't up to tempo. This is what it needs to sound like.
Yeah.
So there's this weird kind of
There's like pressure.
interplay there.
Yeah,
Pressure.
like they're picturing the original and it's kind of in their head.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I get that. I having put on the simplest, having put on the simplest chamber music concert with some high schoolers back in the day, thinking about the way that we wanted like Castlevania music to be at tempo, but those tempos are synthesized and like not as executable on our instruments. They are a lot more keyboard idiomatic too. So like translating that to strings, like we worked really hard to get things as close to tempo as possible. And like these two students were just like once in a lifetime students. They just nailed it. But it was a real process. That was a big thing of like, okay, do we take this slower for reasons of like helping the audience to kind of hear? You can kind of play stuff too fast for people to really like apprehend what you're doing too. Mm-hmm. And certain halls just don't accommodate it well, where it gets muddy, unless it's just absolutely articulate and clean and perfect. So like there's things to think about with tempos that go way beyond just the idealized version in your head. So oh yeah, Tales Symphony arrangement. It's true. And it can stick in your head in such powerful ways too. Yeah, it's like seeing all these memories of folks going to concerts. So, Final Symphony stands apart with its extreme highbrow aspirations. Notice highbrows in quotes. Rather than a set of orchestral suites and standalone pieces based on orchestral transcriptions of 8 and 16 music, which is what we most often get in these concerts, Final Symphony program instead borrows music from 3 Final Fantasy games, 6, 7, and 10, and freely arrange the music from these into, quote, proper classical symphonic forms. So we have a tone poem, a symphony, and a concerto. So...
yeah, and it's not even form necessarily. Genre is actually the better word. I think I changed that in the dissertation adaptation. Because formally, what is a tone poem, right?
Sure.
It's through composed, right? The symphony, and Will talks about this in his chapter, Will Gibbons, it's a 3-movement symphony, which is a little bit unusual. And then the concerto, I guess there is a concerto form kind of, but it's not the classical concerto form that it follows. So
right.
Genre, I think, is a better word there. So if I could go back and change that, I would. But
this is what you get to speak to that on this channel. You get to talk about changes.
Yeah.
And they're canon now because they've been broadcast.
Right.
So, case study. This is Masashi Hamazu's contribution to the Final Symphony program, the piano concerto. And so this is the first game where Uematsu wasn't sole composer, and Hamazu was one of the others, and so took his own music and Uematsu's music to arrange them into this virtuosic piece. And this is aligning with Will Gibbons's classifying of game music from Unlimited Replays, whole chapter on classifying game music. Not as in categorizing, as in making classical. In case I think most of these people know this, but just in case. Yeah. Case study drawing from Peter Zendi's work on arrangement and transcription, which is so useful. I get, as somebody who does transcription and arranging and orchestrating, those 3 things are very different, and sometimes folks will use language that implies one when really they want the other. This happened when I did the Machine Gun Kelly arrangements in August, I think summer last year, on a very quick turnaround. And originally it was pitched to me as a string quartet arrangement. So, I followed what was in the version they gave me that they were going to use in the concert, but, I added like little things. And then I was told, like, what is all this? And then I was given these kind of source tracks that had like synthesized versions of the string, and then it became clear, and like I adapted pretty quickly, but it became clear they wanted a transcription of that and just translating it into real strings. But this is why like actually drawing these distinctions is really important. And I'm doing a huge orchestration right now, and like I've talked about, like there are moments where we could turn it into an arrangement if we decided we want to like floof it up a little and like add some stuff. But in general, it's a lot of orchestrating is like what goes where,
Yeah.
So those are different skills, and I think it's really useful to think about these different approaches to
Yeah.
taking the music and turning it into something else.
I mean, something that'll come up when we get to Dancing Mad is there can still be creative license even in transcriptions, and I
Yeah.
want to make that clear as well, because I think a lot of people would kind of be like, "Oh, well, arrangement is more creative than transcription, not so much." It's like,
Right.
no, it's just different levels or different types of
Hmm.
creativity that go into it. So
Yes, and transcription and orchestrating are often related too, in that sense of like you're putting it down and you're figuring out where it goes.
hmm
Yeah, transcription, as anybody who has read my dissertation knows, I have one landscape page in my entire dissertation, and it is because I was showing a quote, more accurate transcription of a single measure of a track from Dr. Mario versus how you would put it in kind of musical terms.
hmm
If you have something as simple as a glissando sound, a sweep, do you do every step of that gliss? Because that's how it's encoded. It's encoded discretely. It is not encoded
Yeah,
as
yeah.
a continuous sweep up the scale or whatever it is. So, but if you want to do that, suddenly you're having septuplet groupings in 128th notes. so, transcription is not simple. so
No, no, yeah.
most of the time you kind of do it based on your musician ear, right? And you're like, okay, I'm just gonna write gliss here. I,
Yeah.
so it's absolutely not always recognize those differences. So I really appreciate how you start by outlining those differences and then giving us examples of each.
hmm
That's one thing I really think is useful and helpful in this chapter, even beyond these specific examples.
Yeah.
So I didn't look up the name. Is it Christopher Hoyne?
I'm not sure actually. I think I've said Hun,
Hun?
but I do
If
not
anyone
know.
can correct my pronunciation,
Yeah.
I apologize. I meant to look this up, and I have a toddler. It is what it is. Some days I don't sit at the computer physically until right when I need to.
Yeah.
So there's a if you look up the Final Fantasy X piano concerto, this analysis is one of the first things that'll pop up on the SEO. So it kind of walks you through the whole piece in order. It kind of mentions where all the different themes are coming from, and sort of it's a nice like listening guide to the piece. So maybe I can drop that link in the chat in a moment here. But so this is an interesting analysis because it sort of notes like it's not necessarily the most like famous or recognizable or like go-to Final Fantasy X pieces. Instead, it's more about like them on a musical level and what's going to get developed motivically. But the entire analysis ends up tracking every fragment in quotation. Let me drop that really quick.
So something to say about this, and I think I realized this after the fact. The pieces that are chosen in particular are ones that Hamatsu was one of the main composers on. So yes, there are some Uematsu pieces as well, Xanarkin being the most obvious one. Um, but the
Oh,
other
Huin.
pieces that
Sorry, I'm
are,
reading the
yeah, I
chat.
saw
Huin
that,
would make
yeah.
sense. Yeah, like
But
when.
the rest of the pieces, the like maybe quote unquote kind of random ones, are all pieces that Hamatsu did instead. And so and there's a quote, I'm guessing that'll come up a little later, where Hamatsu is basically saying like, this was my second go through with these pieces that I wrote, right? And I wasn't able to necessarily do everything I wanted to in the context of the game with them. So now I had this kind of freedom and agency to do that. I also want to note, because I think this somehow got cut, Roger Wanamo was the orchestrator for this. So Hamatsu was the composer / arranger, but Roger Wanamo is actually the one who did the orchestration, and Hamatsu is on record saying like, this is such a beautiful and amazing orchestration in particular. So I want to make sure that I do acknowledge that, because I think it got left out.
Yeah, and just and recognizing the layers of labor here, right? Like
Labor,
that there
yeah.
was the composing, and then there was the probably a bit of transcription, depending on how these things were originally created for 10. A little bit of transcription and arranging, and then some orchestrating as well.
Yeah.
So they're all kind of and Rich I think points out here the idea of a lot of us do kind of both, right? Like the idea of starting as much of a note for note transcription, as we need to do for our purposes, and then adding, making changes, making it fit. going from there.
Yeah.
So this is the question for this piece in particular is why a concerto for Final Fantasy X? And this, you are making a sort of a Ludo narrative argument a little bit, that the appeal of the concerto, and you're going to cite McClary here and get some real musicology up in here, talking about the concerto and its classical associations are about the solo force and society, so like the both the rest of the ensemble and the audience, and so there's this duality in this relationship, and we're using contrasts and sort of depicting the individual versus everyone else, and this ends up being relevant to the plot of 10. So elsewhere you have talked about FF10 as a hyper-real retelling of Japan's history through an imagined Western lens. What is 2017?
So that's the master's thesis. Yeah. And with this in particular, there is a term that I found out, I think within the last year or two, shingeki, which some people might be familiar with was it Shingeki no, is it Kyoin? Attack on Titan, though.
Oh,
and it's
sure.
Japanese name, right? If you've seen Attack on Titan, it's like why is there this like weird kind of like westernization essentially of or in this anime, right? And so I found this out on TikTok, right? The most academic of all sources.
Yep.
This person was basically explaining like what Shingeki means, and I was like, oh, this is exactly what I was trying to argue. I just again didn't have the vocabulary back then necessarily, or not necessarily. I just did not have the vocabulary back then, or that cultural understanding or framework to dig a little deeper. So, yeah.
It's like a catalyst to the next thing. So coming back to these ideas, you could always put it in those terms. And we're going to get a lot more on Hymn of the Faith next week with Andrew, who's creeping around the chat here. The Hymn of the Faith is a way of framing the Yevon religion of the game world in a very Western sacred music tradition, and this ultimately culminates with a literal death of God at the game's narrative epoch, one marked by drastic harmonic changes to the hymn. So you're quoting your earlier work on this, but importantly, we have our character, Yuna in particular, becomes persecuted for the way that her beliefs are shifting as she's kind of finding out the real nature of the religion and the folks in charge of the religion and the way that they have known the truth but have been hiding it from the followers. And so she ends up being kind of a good representative of the piano in this framing. So we start recognizing the end of the game. Of course, we do embrace the change that Yuna represents, but along the way, she's facing a lot of conflict over this. So she's an individual against society in terms of narrative conflict.
Yeah.
And here we turn to Susan McClary in 1987, looking at the Fifth Brandenburg Concerto of Bach, which concerto and concerto grosso are always about these contrasts, large forces with the soloists. And of course, the soloists often have the really virtuosic, decorated material versus the more accompanimental figures. And so there's that contrast in sheer sound and forces and writing style. So ends up being a nice fit here for the Final Fantasy X. Roughly, we kind of go with the game narrative. Movement 1 is Zenerkend, where players start the game. Movement 2 is Inori, which is Hymn of the Faith. It's based mostly on Hymn of the Faith. And Movement 3 is Kessen, the final battle. And it includes kind of all the phases of the final battle.
Yeah.
And piano is representative of Yuna in this reading, but it also reflects part of the society in which it is interacting, especially in that second movement. So this is a really neat way. If you read the Huen article, that's a walkthrough, but then read this one too and then listen to the piece. It's a nice way to be thinking about the music as it's happening, especially if you really know the game, which I do not. As I often tell the story, I started 10 and the sphere grid freaked me out and I didn't play on.
Yeah.
I hated the sphere grid.
So Final Fantasy X was my first Final Fantasy, actually.
Was it?
Technically, I think maybe Final Fantasy Tactics Advance was before that, but that's also kind of very different.
Right.
In a lot of ways.
Gameplay.
So first mainline game was Final Fantasy X.
Yeah. The sphere
So
grid, it just stressed me out. I like still have anxiety thinking about it.
I I messed up my Kamari on the first playthrough, and he was just totally useless for like the entire game. He can be very good if you plan ahead, I guess, and like you know what you're planning on doing with him. And I was just like all over the place, and
Yeah. That's the
you're
thing
just
is like
like,
if I don't know the game yet, how do I know what I want to do with them? And then I feel like I'm stuck in a place where I can't make a choice at all.
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
struggle with it. I need very limited choices of like when I'm leveling up. Like, give me a choice of a few different bonuses, like
yeah,
Mario RPG style. Do you want more hit points? Do you want to attack a little more? Like,
yeah.
that's kind of what I'm best at handling. And the funny thing is, I've done games that have like skill trees, but I think implicit to a lot of those skill trees is you could like I'm thinking of like Assassin's Creed or The Witcher. Like, you can kind of go back and get most of them. It was always very clear to me, like in The Witcher, that I could like undo and like reassign points if I wanted to. So I didn't. I felt early on like the sphere grid didn't do that, or at least it wasn't
You
presented to me in that
can
way.
kind of do it, but no, yeah. I mean, it's like you start a path and you pretty much have to stick with that path.
Yeah,
So it can be very punishing.
ugh, yeah, and that's really hard for a completionist because you kind of want to just unlock all of it.
Yeah,
So
I've never complete. Well, like I mean, I've beaten the game multiple times, of course, but I've never like completionist run Final Fantasy X. It's just too much,
hmm
especially with the mini games for like the legendary weapons. I'm not gonna dodge lightning 200 times. No, just no.
I was talking about this chapter and Andrew's coming up. Of
Yeah,
course, these pair beautifully together because they're both talking about 10, but also how I again I hadn't played it beyond the
yeah,
beginning because of all those stresses, and I was like, we should stream it, Ryan, haha. And he's like, there's like 14 hours just of cutscene in this game, like
yeah.
that's 7 weeks of streaming just the cutscenes.
Perfect.
This is the problem we run into with
Yeah,
JRPGs when we want to do like a whole game, and like some of these modern like I've joked a lot about like we need to do The Witcher, but like how do we do The Witcher 3? We almost have to take like one of my saves that's really far along and just kind of go to
yeah.
different areas and like explore the music that way, but like there's not a good way to do a lot of the like a full playthrough of some of these games are so big.
I mean, the only thing I can think of is like a summer project where you're actually streaming probably more than usual.
Right.
So it's not just even Thursday nights. It's like, I don't know, Tuesdays and Thursdays and Saturdays or something
And
like
like,
that.
yeah, for more time even.
Yeah.
More
Uh,
plastic duck simulator it is then, Dana. Did you see us last night?
I didn't know.
I demoed a game called Placid Plastic Duck Simulator, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You
Amazing.
can't even control where the ducks go. You just
Oh,
have to
good.
watch them appear in your pool, and
Yeah.
they're all different, and you can name them. And the music is great, actually.
Okay, I'll check it out. Yeah.
Stardew, we did. I'll have to find the VOD because we did a stream that coincided. It was on my birthday, and so I got to choose. And I said, "Well, we're gonna do tours of my Stardew farm." So I showed everybody my farms. I think Ryan has those, so I'll have to link that to you. Felt cute. Anyway, I feel like I'm learning so much about 10.
Yeah.
But I remember reading Andrew's chapter so slowly because like there's a lot of just explaining the plot of 10, and I'm like, I don't know 10, so it took me a while to read it because I was trying to just understand all the moving parts of this religious takedown.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is where those like nice little tidy 10 to 20 minutes summary videos on YouTube come in very handy.
That's
Like I
true.
watched that first for like even for Kingdom Hearts or something like that,
Yeah.
right? So like I do
Same.
not remember all the details of blah blah blah. And even still I watch the video and I'm like, okay, I get like 60% of it now rather than 30. Because it's just Kingdom Hearts is notoriously convoluted. Final Fantasy X is not that bad, but
Right. Well, yeah, and anytime you talk about like a whole franchise, like a Zelda
yeah.
franchise, and like the
Yeah.
interconnections between those games and a timeline, and oof.
I had to do the exact same thing again when I was writing about Symphony of the Goddesses for the dissertation, because I'm not a huge Zelda person, so I was like, I just need to understand how these all go together. And I watched
hmm
like probably 5 hours worth of like explanation videos. I was like, okay, I mostly get it now, so I can write this chapter and not feel like I don't know what I'm talking about. But
Yeah, and I will say for folks asking for co-op Stardew, absolutely that would be amazing, but I wouldn't be able to host because of the mods on my game. I would have to join like somebody else's, because then I've tried this actually. A friend of mine and I tried like to see, does it appear to you like, because I'm hosting, and like the crops won't even show up for her if she doesn't have them installed. So good to note if you play modded Stardew. But yeah, I think the Stream Team all has a great game. Anyway. So anyway, the concerto, very much based on the Hymn of the Faith. We're going to get a lot more on that next week. The hymn itself and or chorale, depending on how it's being used, and or Gregorian chant, and or is of course indexing religious, especially Western Catholic religious connotations, but also, especially the chorale settings, we have this sense of like the communal nature of the worship as well. And so then the piano solo playing this decorated version of the hymn against a kind of a cantus firmus on the hymn played by the orchestra. And then it moves Attacca into the third movement, signals not only the musical but the narrative ties between the two as well. So really beautiful reading of this. And then the ending of the concerto, just before the middle point of the final movement, we get a full voiced iteration of the hymn played again by the solo piano, and then reiterated in the antepenultimate phrase of the move. Fancy word.
Yeah, good. I use it in class sometimes. Like, it's a good GRE word, and
it's a great GRE word.
Roll
Love it.
their eyes at me, and I'm like, it's fine.
It's fine. It's fine. I love a good word.
Yeah, I just like don't overuse them, right? Where it becomes so hard to just read, but every now and then sprinkle them in, I think.
Yeah, I'm such like a poetry nerd too. I like the feeling of language.
My poetry shelf right there.
Yeah.
One of them. So yeah.
Who's your favorite poet?
I really like Lucia. Her work is really, really quite nice. Ezra Pound, problematic figure, but really like his poetry as well. So
nice.
Yeah.
I'm a big Saul Williams girl myself.
Okay. Nice.
I like that sort of it almost feels like, well, it's like hip hop and poetry, you know, and it's but and the wordplay is just so clever throughout. But yeah, I'm also, you know, I bet it surprises nobody, I'm a big Mary Oliver fan. I like just feeling like that back to nature sense of being in a Mary Oliver poem. And the way, you know, she's just like, have you ever really thought about geese? You know, it's like she gets you to just kind of sit down and contemplate these very like everyday things.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, big poetry nerd here. Yeah, Amanda Gorman's Book of Poems. Beautiful. Good to see you, Ryan. We talked about your Kingdom Hearts chapter earlier. That's coming out soon, April 26th.
Oh, we have the date now. Nice.
Yes.
Yeah.
I looked it up on the Routledge site because I was like, when is this coming out?
Yeah.
So we'll be spending probably May with some chapters from that book, which is nice. Gives me some things to put on the channel. Been having trouble getting people to respond, so I'm like panicking. Like, what am I going to do in April?
Yeah.
We're going to do things, but I don't know what they'll be. Figuring that out, but we do have some yeses in the works, and
Good.
You know, I'll publish as I get stuff confirmed.
Good. Yeah.
And then Summer of Summers. Actually, I wonder if I can do that from here. Oh, I can. Maybe. No? Maybe? Oh ho ho! All right, let me just do this poll really quick.
Oh, the Summer of Summers.
Summers.
Yeah.
Which summers for summer. Learned how to do this last night on Ryan's channel, and we were having people vote on whether you pronounce it GIF or GIF.
Oh God.
It was very contentious, but GIF won by a landslide.
As it should, yeah.
Understanding video game music. I'll just put VGM because it doesn't fit, or Ocarina.
Oh, that's right. UNT's doing their symposium. It's virtual this year. That's right as well. Yeah. Need to make sure I tune in for that.
All right, we're gonna set that for 10 minutes. Start the poll. Bam.
All right, time to vote.
Folks can vote on, and I already did a Twitter poll, so in general, understanding has been winning, but it's close enough. I may as well keep asking over the next few weeks and just see see what folks think.
Yeah.
Oh, Ghibli or Ghibli?
I mean,
Wow.
so this is a whole one, right? The katakana I think is Yuri, but I think it's supposed to
Oh.
be pronounced Ghibli.
Yeah, and I've heard a lot of my friends will say Ghibli.
Uh-huh.
So, ooh.
And then there's so for Procyon Studios, uh, the English version of it, right? English pronunciation of it. But if you read the katakana, it's Procyon Studios.
Mm.
'Cause I asked Miriam Abenasser about this, and she's like, I never really thought about it. But yeah, you're right. It's Procyon in Japanese, but or in the katakana at least, but then probably Procyon in the general English pronunciation. Gotta love it.
Yeah, I've definitely, friends who aren't like Japanese scholars just like the movies. I've
Oh
heard a lot
yeah.
of them say Ghibli, just like around me, but
Hmm.
this could be regional too, Maybe this is just what the Clevelanders say.
Hmm.
Um, there's, Aerith or Eris.
God.
We
Uh,
won't go there.
no, we won't.
We won't go there. Because that's another, how are you translating
Yeah.
the kana here? All right, so let's see. Ending, just full voice. Oh, okay, yeah. Iterated before the antepenultimate phrase. Love that turn of phrase. Just before the concerto ends, the hymn ends up being this constructive part of the musical texture as a whole, but also connects to this idea of the decisive battle at the end in this final movement, which is our depiction of the final battles, and ends up just serving as a nice whiz bang conclusion to the whole texture, because you want to have that final movement really sock it to us.
Yeah.
You don't want things to end on kind of a down note.
Nope.
Generally,
Nope.
and of
Generally.
course when it's done well it works, but
Chopin Ballad #1. But
yeah,
anyways.
yeah, exactly.
Yes.
um Arranging, really a lot of these, but because transcription is a kind of listening too, but all of these things are about how somebody is hearing a work.
Hmm.
And so thinking of it that way, instead of getting into all these things about intention or like how are they capturing this, like looking at what they're changing and how can actually give us a sense of what they're prioritizing, what they're hearing, and this is the way that arrangers are their own art form, in that we're not just describing what we hear, we're sort of translating it for folks to play.
Yeah.
And the first spoken words in Final Fantasy were in Final Fantasy X. Titus saying, "Listen to my story." All about how my life got turned upside down.
Yeah. That's how I remember it going.
Yeah, something like that,
Something
right?
like
It's
that.
it's
Yeah.
something like that. And the Uematsu's Anarchan track is playing underneath that. So placing that at the beginning of the concerto is to evoke that plea to listen, and by extension, hey, listen to the music as we hear it. As our orchestrators, arrangers, transcribers all hear it. I like you called your section transcribing mad. So we're going to look at a transcription. Dancing mad ends up remaining a little more stable because it tends to be more on the transcription end of the spectrum than as an arrangement. And you sort of relate this to the idea of the full suite, like as a multi-movement form, is this kind of neo-romantic work. It has extended duration, clever use of quotation, both intertextual and leitmotivic. So it's already a pretty ambitious piece. So to do this as a montage, where you're doing an arrangement with other pieces in it, it's sort of hard to excerpt this.
Yeah. I mean, it has been done. I think I put this in a footnote in, what do they call it? It's in one of the Square Enix arrangement CDs. I'm trying to remember what it's actually called, but they have a version that just clips like a, I don't know, 10-minute segment of it. It's really, really unusual, I think, at least. And then in the final boss suite for symphonic, which one is it for? Symphonic, not Legends, that's Nintendo. Symphonic Odysseys, that's Uematsu. Symphonic, oh gosh, what's the last one? I don't know. Anyways, one of Bucker's symphonic suites, they had the final boss battle suite, and again, it's kind of excerpted into that. It's a really interesting arrangement just as a whole. It's actually quite effective, I think. More effective than the more remix of the previous one that I mentioned. But
Yeah.
yeah.
But in general, like it's a big one. It's like
Yes. Yeah.
it's like what are you gonna excerpt here?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, which probably the most arguably recognizable is the fifth bit, where it kind of goes full prog rock on us. But
And that's usually what they do clip from. Yeah.
yeah, so yeah, it becomes a question of what, like, it's already kind of itself existing as this larger form, so it's suited to be more directly transcribed. So as opposed to arrangements where there's a lot more adaptation happening, transcriptions take what Leonard Meyer would call the primary parameters of the piece. So melody, harmony, and rhythm as generally mutable and focus instead on changing secondary parameters. So instrumentation, timbre, and dynamics. I like this framing here from Meyer.
Yeah.
So 3 different transcriptions of Dancing Mad. The version from the piano opera Final Fantasy 456 from 2012. This was an album transcribed and performed by Hiroyuki Nakayama. The Black Mages, this was Uematsu's first prog rock band. Their cover, which was on their debut album in 2003. And then the Distant Worlds 2, more music from Final Fantasy concert from 2010. And the recording was by the Royal Stockholm Philharmonic Orchestra, Elmhurst College Concert Choir, and Earthbound Papas, Uematsu's second prog rock band.
So we can't have just one.
Can't have just one. It's like a Pringle.
Yeah.
So here, the most interesting point of departure for all 3 of these is how do they handle the endings? Because as we know, possibly in boss battles, we're going to loop until we enter the next phase. And so there's kind of the 3 main sections of the like Tower of Demons, Gods, you know, fallen angels, whatever it is, that you're fighting until you actually get Kefka, who then has a little short introduction that's part 4, the big he's coming out of the sky, and then we get into the full prog rock for the battle with him specifically. So those are just going to keep looping, and they're not designed to be seamless necessarily. They're not definitive endings, because the idea is you're going to go on to the next phase. So we have to figure out what to do with that. Anytime that we're making an arrangement to transcription, how do you end it? Or even in studio, you know, like a Beatles song where it just fades.
Yeah.
That's like a classic. And then you have a concert version. Like, how do you end it? Because you can't just fade out. Not really. I guess you could like lower the dial on the soundboard.
It's not the same. I think wasn't there a famous example where they did, which song was it? Is it All You Need Is Love? One of their big songs though, for a live TV broadcast, and then they had to figure out how to end it, and I don't remember what they ended up doing, but I know it was like this whole big thing.
Yeah, or like a Hey Jude, where it just keeps repeating the chorus over and over and over, and you're like, okay, Hey Jude, the end. 5-1. Like,
yes.
What do you do, and how do you make that not sound stilted? Because there is something about like when it loops and kind of goes on, it like kind of goes off into the ether, being its own thing.
Yeah.
So the endings are really interesting here for the sections leading up to the Dancing Mad, but then Dancing Mad itself, the end of the actual Dancing Mad loop has the Kefka laugh. And it's pretty seamless. It's not like the end, yay, because it's not through composed. Just however long it takes you to beat Kefka, which could be a very long time depending on how you've leveled everybody who you have in the party at that point, because you have to rank everyone, and maybe they get killed off in earlier phases and you don't have your dream team. So you have to kind of be ready for it.
Yeah.
So the form of the suite is, I like your description here. The first section is a ponderous intro. Number 2 is an off-kilter march. 3 is an extended 18th century style organ feature. 4 is a direct quotation of the game's opening, probably an allusion to Strauss's also Sprach Zarathustra. and then 5, an epic prog rock conclusion. And all but the 4th of these loop. And the 4th is the kind of, hey, Kafka's here. I'm going to sneeze.
Yeah.
Excuse me. I could feel it coming. So yes, the 4th does not loop. It is just a straightforward, here it is. And then all the others loop. So we have to figure out what to do. And then even when you beat the final form, the music abruptly fades as his sprite disintegrates. So even on the official soundtrack, it does a fade. We opt to just fade out. So what does it mean to have an ultimate incarnation of Dancing Mad on the OST or on transcriptions? It is productive to think of transcriptions as specific. And here you bring in politics. You talk about political hearings.
Yes,
You want to expand on that
okay.
for a sec?
Yeah, I realized, I thought I had cited Anne-Marie Moll's ontological politics, so this question of ontology, right? So what something is, this method of being. The idea of ontological politics is things tend not to be fixed or immutable, right? Depending on like definitions, and so she actually refers to the medical field in this regard. Depending on like which kind of doctor you're talking to, they will have different definitions for different things, and so you kind of have to pick and choose which you're discussing or how you're talking about something. You can kind of say it's all of them at some level, right? But at the same time, if you're trying to be a little bit more specific, you're going to have to say, I'm talking about it in this way. But you have to choose. You have to make that political choice, right? You have options, so you choose, you vote, right? You have this political choice to stick with one definition, or in this case, this kind of ending, right? So how you choose to end the piece, you are making that conscious choice. So that is the political decision. Yes, I realized too late, and I was like, oh, I think maybe I had it initially, and maybe it got kind of cut in the editing or something. But
does it show up in the dissertation kind of version of this
work?
Yeah.
So Anne-Marie Moll is the academic who came up with this idea of ontological politics. So
thank you for explaining that.
Yes,
I think that it's so useful to think about these like as political choices, but just making sure that we unpack, like, we're not talking about like US politics. It's not like that kind of politics, right? It is the idea of choice making and voting and sort of staking your claim on a particular version. So, and we have to make that choice because, again, do you just like, I don't know, do a Aniente, like decrescendo, like how do you really do that kind of fade or like repeat? And it's very hard to do that well in a concert version. Again, you could, if it's electronic, then you could have somebody at the soundboard just turn it down, but like that doesn't tend to work very well in live performance. No, it's very very hard to do that well. So usually we want a definitive ending, and then folks can kind of go, oh, okay, clap. If you're fading out, they're kind of waiting for it. So especially if it's a closer, because this is a really real banger of a closer, we want it to be exciting, to get people on their feet. Yeah. So Nakayama's transcription is much more of a one-to-one mapping of the 16-bit version to the piano. So probably a pretty direct transcription to begin with, and then figuring out sort of how to put that in the hands, because there are more channels than there are fingers at times. Yeah. So there are going to be some choices made to translate this. Yeah. But in general, it's a pretty direct mapping within any of those idiomatic limitations. And this is the only one that contains that fourth section. And so all the others leave it out as merely a ludic signal of Kafka's arrival, despite its relationship to the title screen. So you kind of get into this a little bit, that this has so much significance in the game narrative and sort of the overall form of the game, and yet it tends to be left out in the concert versions. Yeah,
I actually have a quote from Nakayama. So when I first wrote this, I didn't actually have the CD yet, so I wasn't able to read the liner notes. I put it in chat.
Thank you.
But so this is in the dissertation if you're interested. So Nakayama says, easily the most deserving of the title piano opera, this piece, so Dancing Mad, is truly a work of epic operatic scale. While arranging this multi-movement opus, I tried to capture the ambiance of a full orchestra, just as if I were scoring a symphony for sole piano. And so this is probably alluding to the Liszt piano scores. which Tim Summers also talks about actually. But this idea of saying like, I'm going to take, a full orchestra or synthesized orchestra or whatever, right, and kind of condense it down into a piano, but somehow make the piano really feel like it is presenting a full orchestra rather than like, oh yeah, it's solo piano. It's like, no, it's like piano as orchestra.
Right.
So whether or not that's successful, up to you to decide, but that's the idea and impetus behind it.
Right. Right. So just because we are moving to a singular instrument, fingers can still do a lot, especially if you have a really virtuosic player.
Yes.
But there are still choices that get made to try to make it as big as possible, as big of a sound as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the fourth, leaving out the fourth is a very strange moment. Got this kind of like building up of the chord and like chordal intervals and then a big da da.
Yeah.
Very Zarathustra.
Yes.
Which a bunch of us have noted. Like not a very subtle connection for most of us make that connection like almost instantly upon hearing it. But it's the first thing you hear when you turn on the game, right? Like it's priming you for that, and then when it shows up at the very end as he appears, it like recontextualizes that title screen for you in a cool way. So to leave it out, it is musically a bit of a stop in the momentum, which I think is probably the reason, right?
Yeah.
As an introduction to the fifth section, it does feel a little jarring, but I think it's meant to.
Yeah, I mean, but I think, and this is part of the point I try and make at least, is if you're playing the game, it makes a lot of sense, like ludically, right? You're like, this is it.
Here's
this
Kafka.
here it is.
Here he is.
But if you're just listening to an arrangement, then yes, just having this kind of like jarring, like, what's happening? Why are we here? What's going on, right? So this is the idea of transcribing or taking into account whether something is going to be like a multimedia production, so audio visual fully, or if we're just saying, it's quote unquote just the music itself, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And again, you could probably do some things to arrange it so it kind of flows a little bit better between them, but it just goes to show you, again, it's a political hearing of like that is being a more ludic thing than necessary to the musical texture of the suite necessarily for these purposes. So Nakayama included some newly composed material at the very end of part 5. So not only do we have the part 4 only appearing in this Nakayama version, but we also have some newly composed material at the end, which is oscillating between major and minor of the concluding key, which gives you that like picardy third moment. So it kind of draws back to the Baroque, which is also very appropriate for Dancing Mad, which gets very Baroque in some other moments with its organ counterpoint. I talk about the quote failed fugue. I have like a toccata and fugue connection as I talk about it. So it's drawing on these religious connotations. Of course, Kafka is presented as sort of a Lucifer, fallen angel type figure. He's got the giant wings, and he's seeing himself as kind of an anti-god of magic, just wanting to destroy everything. So it like kind of plays on that religious connotation. But you could also read this as Beethovenian, by the Beethoven of game music.
I didn't even think about that, but yeah.
With the major representing our party and the minor representing Kafka and evil. So this kind of like, yes, we win over evil. The Black Mages version, so Uematsu's first prog rock band, isn't just the final, most obviously prog rocky section, which is interesting. Like you would expect, okay, it's a prog band doing a prog album, they'll probably just do part 5, but they do 1, 2, 3, and 5. And so that it kind of reinterprets, retranslates, rehears stuff that doesn't sound prog in the earlier things. Well, that's maybe that's too sweeping of a statement, because of course prog, as we know, gets very into classical music, especially in the 70s. But it's not presented in like a prog rock doing Baroque in the original. And here we're getting that sort of translation. It makes the Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Alan Parsons like type connections a lot clearer for us, because it's like a way of hearing those first three movements kind of in context and sort of making them fit into this genre.
Yeah.
And here we get some vamps. We get some guitar solo moments by Tsuyoshi Sakito, and then returning to the beginning of Dancing Mad, so the first section. So instead of getting section 4, we kind of go back to part 1, and then concluding with a chiming bell that fades out over a pedal drone. So this ends up being cyclical, which is interesting. Not in the context of the game, where the fourth section would go, but intramusically to itself. And I find the cyclicism also kind of interesting because so much prog rock I think of as more episodic and linear. Like it's going on to the next thing.
Yeah.
Not that there's never return, but like I don't think of it as being as cyclical of a form. So this ends up being interesting because Uematsu is directly connected to it. It's official in a way that makes it the precedent for future iterations, including Distant Worlds. So that's an important one, and so the changes being made to it get kind of canonized too. And then Distant Worlds is kind of a mix of the other two, but we can map the 16-bit timbres onto, quote, real instruments, right? Violins can be violins or whatever, but the prog rock section has that same solo and loop back to part 1 that the Black Mages one does. But the Distant Worlds version also takes that Picardy third idea that we heard in Nakayama's transcription. So it's kind of a synthesis of these two ideas. Do we have a sense that they knew or were referencing Nakayama, or just kind of came to the same conclusion that it was an effective tool?
I think more the latter. This one's an interesting, what's the word I'm looking for? Is it pedigree? Is that the word I'm looking for? Like the history of who actually arranged this Distant Worlds version. It's quite interesting. I didn't find it out until the dissertation research. So I was emailing Thomas Becker a little bit, and he was saying that Arnie Roth did make some kind of changes to this eventually. So for the 2007 iteration of it, or I think it's 2007. But Adam Clemens actually was the original arranger, and he did this for one of Bucker's concerts. So back in like the early 2000s. And then so Arnie was like a consultant, I think, or something for those. And so there's this kind of like interplay between where the arrangement started and where it ended up. In really interesting ways. So the timeline is kind of stretched even there.
There's an interesting lineage here, or I guess provenance.
Provenance,
Getting at that idea. Complicated. Because I mean, of course it's not impossible, especially with all the other Baroque illusions, that like a Picardy third is not like so unique of a tool to use, right?
Right.
But it is interesting that this ends up being kind of a synthesis of these ideas from other hearings. Other people hear it too.
Yeah.
So transcription is something we can tease apart further, just as we can tease apart what an arrangement is. And again, I like to think of these as being on a spectrum in terms of like activities with existing music. And just by nature of what you are putting the music on, the instruments, ensembles, how many people per part, each transcription is going to bring out different things of the source piece, kind of make us hear it differently, just as even different versions of the same piece across multiple concerts. This is why we can play Beethoven over and over again, right? You go to hear this conductor's interpretation of Beethoven, and sometimes you hear things that you didn't hear before. And folks who love that will bring scores with them to the orchestra, and even folks who aren't professional musicians, I see them do this. They have their little pocket score, and they're like listening to the music, and they'll say like, "Oh wow, I never really noticed this like English horn solo in this, whatever it is, whatever piece they're listening to that they're passionate about." So this can be really exaggerated in a transcription based on how someone is hearing it and how they are translating that for us. So the piano version, of course, it isn't going to retain the timbre of the original soundtrack, because you would just play the soundtrack, or you would do something like I did in my Celeste multi-track, where like I recorded most of the parts on strings, but I encoded some chiptune as well. Like you could easily do that type of thing where you're accompanying yourself. course, I wasn't using the original for that. I was re-encoding it on FamiTracker to make it sound even older. It was silly, but
That's good.
it was silly. I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So we can do things to make it sound like the original, but here we're putting it on piano. But it also ends up simplifying some of the textures while ornamenting others. So there's moments where we just can't physically play 8 channels if there's stuff happening in most or all of them. But we might choose to decorate a melodic line or something like that. And so this is what you do when you have 2 hands versus 8 channels. But the other versions have more players available and more instruments available. And so they end up doing some interesting things with the kind of timbral palettes that they have. But they are able to leave out part of the music that is in the game itself. So we get this reinterpretation of the significance of the pieces of that suite. And I think prior to maybe these hearings, a lot of us saw it as a 5-part suite, right?
Mhm.
It gets kind of treated that way in even
Yeah.
like the OSTs and stuff.
Yeah.
So then to have a version that leaves it out is really interesting.
Yeah.
It's like saying it almost doesn't work outside of its ludic context,
Yeah.
which isn't saying it's bad.
No. I mean, it's
None
just
of
like,
this is that type of argument. But
right. It's just making these conscious choices, right? And so being intentional, I think, with your arrangement or transcription or whatever you want to call it, right? And saying, I'm thinking through this and why I would or wouldn't include a certain section, or why I would or wouldn't ornament or something like that. Something that otherwise, quote unquote, may or may not need it. So.
yeah. So this isn't about authenticity. Back off. No, I don't. No one in the chat is doing that.
Yeah.
But the interest is in looking at the transcription process itself, the arranging process, the orchestration process, and differences in how it can be enacted on the same piece. Especially stuff like this that gets replayed and remixed and over and over and over again. We get to get all these different hearings, including if you go to like an OC remix and you look up Dancing Mad, you're going to hear some folks translating things into totally different genres. I love that type of like when we mash it up and suddenly it sounds like I tried to find for the opening of the stream today, like an Irish version of some FF10 music. You can get all these different hearings and they're all going to kind of coexist. So it's a really nice place to look at this process versus something that isn't as covered or transcribed or presented on concerts. This is a fruitful place to look at this. So Uematsu has this place in our canon in that he's being considered classical in a lot of ways. Partially, it's that he is early in the history of video game music, relatively early in terms of like a wall-to-wall soundtrack approach that we start getting in like Nintendo and Super Nintendo and Genesis and some of these, versus the earlier systems that had fewer channels and less space to have music other than kind of short things between sequences.
It's like the medieval and Renaissance,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. A lot of monophonic Atari, where maybe we get some percussion, but maybe the other channel is just doing sound effects, like very much so. And so he's in this kind of classical or maybe Baroque or whatever era of game composing, so he gets kind of classified in that way. Of course, the sounds that he's indexing, even on 8 and 16-bit soundtracks, like on an 8-bit game, there's always that, what am I going to call this an instrument? It's a square wave, But in 16-bit, you do start getting to the point where you can go, this sounds pretty much like a violin. I'm going to call it a violin.
Yeah.
And you don't have to be as hand-wringing, or at least I don't have to be as hand-wringing about saying what instrument it is. And it's not that there's never ambiguity. As I always point out, Matthew Valente opened my eyes because on the Terra track, there's that, like, it almost sounds like an acoustic guitar, but not, but it's almost like got a banjo quality. And he's like, oh, it's a bouzouki. The Greek lute instrument. And I was like, I wouldn't have known that without him doing the work to uncover the original samples.
Right.
But it answered like why it never fit into either box for me. So there's ambiguity, but like for the most part, you can say, okay, this is a string sample, this is a brass sample, even if it's a little off. So he's using a lot of classical instruments and kind of orchestral instruments in these scores. And then his music's direct adaptation into the concert hall. So there's kind of 3 levels of canonization here. And then Julianne and Will, actually, in their Uematsu chapter, they argue about repetition, right? And just like the repetition is part of this process as well.
Yeah.
The sheer amount of it, both in the game and outside the game. So the very fact, and now we come back to Liszt, all of this arranging and transcribing activity recalls Liszt in the ways that Liszt was actually doing this with Beethoven, right? Within his proposed musical museum.
Yeah.
But you point out, hey, these are different people. They exist in their own contexts. So, like, we get what you're doing when you say Uematsu is the Beethoven of video game music, but why can't Uematsu just be Uematsu?
Yeah.
Is a little bit of what you're getting at here. Like,
Yeah.
very much an understanding of sort of the mappings that people are doing to make this comparison, but also recognizing, like, in a way it sort of flattens Uematsu's contributions to just make this, oh, he's, just unquestionably this figure of Beethoven. It's like, yeah, but looking at it's really interesting.
Yeah,
and we don't want to just relegate it to a museum piece either, because it kind of shuts down certain ways of thinking through this music in a modern context.
Yeah. And part of the idea with the Liszt element too, and it's like this weird interplay, is like the Imaginary Museum of Musical Works, right? So that's where Ger gets her title for her book from. But the work concept saying, like, this work is like absolute, it's the Victoria, you're not going to change it. Like, there is a definite ontological kind of status there. But then with Liszt is like, maybe I just make a bunch of arrangements, and arrangements actually inherently kind of challenge the Victoria model. So it's a really weird kind of, again, like, interplay between, how, and this is where this would come in, like the authenticity of it, but challenging that authenticity, or challenging that there is only one kind of, like, I think ultimate incarnation is what I use at one point, right? One ultimate incarnation of a work. And then with video game music in particular, every time you play a game, or many times at least, it's gonna be a totally different soundtrack, right? Or like, as you progress, you'll be progressing at different rates, and so how often or frequently you'll hear something will change over time. Some games have cues built in such that, like, dynamic soundtracks essentially, right? So it'll just change based off of that even. So this is getting to, like, Tim Summers' idea of, like, video game music as queer, which I think I briefly reference in a footnote at least.
And Tim has a bunch of things coming out on that, including a chapter in our gender book.
Yes, which I am
on this
extremely excited for.
Yeah, it's gonna be good stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the idea of that, the challenging the authorial voice, because how often as performers or conductors you get told to sort of embody, or almost like serve as some kind of a vessel to be haunted or taken over by the composer, right? Like, in this idea of, like, that's Victoria right there. Like, you're trying to be true to this idea, and that does take a lot of study and time with the music to try to understand it, even though we know that, like, no, the performer is bringing something incredibly important to this, and then the reception of that in turn does something else to the music. But there's something to the way that an arranger steps in and inserts themselves into the creation side of it, that ends up, like, complicating it in a way that I think is a lot more easy to apprehend for people, like the way that Liszt is kind of putting himself between Beethoven and us by having a transcription, right? It's not as simple as just putting it down. And as we've said, transcription is, like, not even that simple in the end, right?
Yeah.
Or like a non-creative act in itself, because now we're not getting Beethoven, because we could just go to Beethoven for Beethoven. We're getting Liszt Beethoven.
Yeah, and so this is that, like, hyphen that I don't think I overtly reference here, but Zendi talks about this hyphen of original composer, first order creator if you want, second order creator, the arranger. And so there's this hyphen that inherently, like, they're laying a stake to saying, like, yes, it is my hearing of this composer, right?
Yeah. Heck, even my orchestrating, like, it's a musical based on the music of Queen, So Queen
Mm,
obviously released recordings, and
mhm.
then when they went to make a show out of it, you do different things. Sometimes the lyrics got changed to make it fit the narrative a little better. Sometimes sections
Yeah.
get extended or cut. Like Bohemian Rhapsody is missing everything up to the piano solo before the voice comes
Oh,
in.
wow.
Their version of it cuts that whole like vocal introduction.
Yeah.
So there's things that change about that. And then that version was scored mostly, as a lot of modern musicals are, for like a rock band, basically. Multi synth rock band. And then the
Yeah.
synth is having to do like string patches. So
Yeah.
then I get told to do an orchestration of it. And then you look at the list of credits. It's like, Brian May and like all
Yeah.
the people that did the show. Like, and then
Yeah.
I'm in there somehow too.
Yeah.
It ends up being an interesting chain.
Hmm.
And I imagine Distant Worlds are the same way, where it's like suddenly there's a lot of people involved in bringing this into this version.
So a lot of so in the okay, and this also became a little not necessarily point of contention, but uh, in the original CDs and programs, they did credit people. It's around two or three in CD release at least, they stopped crediting people and they stopped giving credits in the programs. And I reached out to
Oh,
Eric and I was like, hey, like, would you be
why
willing
did
to
this
share
change?
this with me? Yeah, and he's like, I can't actually do this unless Square Enix approves it. Like, I
Oh,
can't give you this list. So what I ended up doing is one, I found out that my older programs had it, and so I was able to go through there. And then I was also just kind of like charting and tracking where all the arrangements started at least. And so
mm.
that actually accounted for most of them. So I'm sure that there might be an additional like Arnie Roth, Arnie Roth, Arnie Roth, Eric Roth, right?
I
Since those are the
wonder.
two that are in charge of it.
I really wonder about the commercial logic, because obviously Square Enix realized that there was something they needed to protect about that
Yeah.
in
Well, I
order
think part of it is
to
just
no
that
longer publicize it.
I think part of it is just that eventually you do start getting so many names attached to something, it just becomes unwieldy and doesn't look nice and tidy.
Mm.
That's my assumption or my
Yeah,
guess
yeah,
at
yeah.
least. But I mean, like I have most of them figured out again for like at least the core
Yeah.
arrangement. But it that was a whole like
It feels like it adds this
file.
obfuscation, like this layer of secrecy about it. Like you don't get to know who worked on it. Almost reminds me of early video game scores that use pseudonyms in the credits, right? Where it's like
Yeah, yeah,
almost
yeah,
like we don't want you to know because we don't want you poaching our talent or something.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
But like that's probably not it. Like you say, it's probably just this. As the thing accrues more history, it only grows, and
yeah.
it does get a little bit out of hand. But yeah, the fact that it's like difficult to access it without official permission does feel a little bit like, ooh, what are you hiding?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I'm sure it's fine. Let's not create conspiracy
No, no,
theories
yeah, yeah. I'm sure we won't,
about
but
Squeenix here.
Phoenix.
Uh, but that is a really that's an interesting point, that like it's not even easy to hear who all is involved in this. Um, Gosh.
Yeah, I mean,
Anyway,
again,
all
that's
of these are new hearings of
yeah,
the many worlds of Final Fantasy, and so um, what I just love about this chapter is that it doesn't just talk about the process of classifying. Of course, we have other people that have worked on that, but you're doing some interesting things with how the music as a text is being treated, and sort of the different possibilities that are opened up by that translation in whatever form. And I just think it's such an elegant. And I think I told you earlier in the semester I was going to assign part of your dissertation. I kind of wonder if I should just assign this, because this is like such
yeah.
a neat and tidy, like excerptable.
The dissertation is scary in some places. Is just what I'll say.
Well,
So
and props to people that assign disc chapters. This is an undergrad class too, so like if it's grads, like sure, read an entire, no matter how large chapter. I
yeah,
can kind of throw more at them, but yeah, for the undergrads, I feel like something like this is a nice jumping off point, and then can get to a lot of this ends up in the dissertation. And we could maybe look at a little bit of like how it gets expanded. That might be a fruitful.
hmm
That's in a few weeks, so maybe that's the plan.
yeah,
Yeah, I like this one. I think it's very, very assignable, and it gets us kind of thinking about broader musical processes that, again, like you don't necessarily have to do anything with Uematsu to find a lot of value in what's being talked about here in terms of
yeah.
changing music into different forms. So I love it.
Thank you.
I'm
Thank
really
you.
grateful that you sent it to me,
Yeah, yeah.
so that I could could read a copy. So, because I think Hartford has it. I believe they do. I think it's on my reserve list. But I don't have it yet.
Right,
because
right.
it's still
Yeah.
in the phase where we want the libraries to buy it. As I tell everyone about my book, like our book's going to be expensive off the bat, and that's them trying to earn some money back on taking the risk of printing. And
Yeah.
usually they say after about a year is when they kind of see how well it's doing, and then can release the like paperback
Yeah.
version.
I mean, it was really nice that, so when I got to UR, I was just kind of browsing the library stack. I saw the book. I was like, oh, I didn't even ask for them to buy it. It was just they had already purchased it.
That's
So
cool.
that was a good feeling.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
like 99% sure it's on my list, but I didn't have a personal copy yet, so I really appreciated the folks that have been sending me their chapters,
Yeah,
so
of
that I could,
course.
not have to wait a year to do the book. So
Yeah.
that's always a thing in academic land. But get your libraries to buy these books because we want to support the the editors certainly and the presses. But obviously, like it's a lot for like adjuncts students to buy a book right off the press. But like that's why it's important to outline that generally like their approach is to then put out a more accessible version
Yeah.
after they've kind of recouped some cost. So that is to say, like build your library slowly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
get it out of the library until you can, decide. I'm like, am I getting this book out over and over? Then I can kind of think about putting it on my budget to
Yeah.
buy it. So really appreciate the ability to look at this now and get a glimpse into this book. And of course, anybody who likes Final Fantasy stuff will find a lot there. But for more on Final Fantasy, there are lots of folks we can turn to. But this is a piece of the dissertation. You look at kind of broadly concertization, right? Like you have a Kingdom Hearts
Concertization. Yeah.
section. You have other series that you're looking at as well, but this
Yeah.
definitely shows up in the dissertation.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, adjunct. It's part of the channel is trying to make things a little bit accessible. And sometimes you don't know like what all's in the book, and like maybe I need it, maybe I don't, and then you take a gamble, and then you're like, oh no, maybe this wasn't what I need.
Yeah. I
It
will say when
can
I
be
do
an
the gambles, they
expensive
tend to be on
mistake.
sale. So
Yeah. Or like you're at like AMS and they do the book fair, and then you wait till the last day and you like hope
yeah.
you can scoop it up when they're trying
Yeah.
to get rid of it so they don't travel with it.
Yes.
I always get really random. I never get the books I want when I do that,
Right.
but I always get like I have a book on like the history of polka, and
Nice.
like this was a real score for me at an AMS. So like you can always find some really interesting things there. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time.
Mm-hmm.
It's been really really kind of you.
Oh yeah, of
I'm grateful to
course.
everybody who is willing to join me for this journey. And I know a lot of folks are so excited to get a look at this book because I do think it's in libraries, but a lot of us don't have personal copies yet. So it's really cool to get to look at this so fast.
Yeah.
And also just have you on the channel. I can't wait for all your stuff that's in process to start
Yeah.
making its way out.
Bit by
Even
bit.
when you were dissertating, we were all like, everyone was awaiting that dissertation in the field. So
Yeah.
so
It's
we were so
fine.
excited to see that happen. And I know like Jen's here in chat, same thing. We're all like, okay, when's Jen gonna finish? So we can all like cite that dissertation. And no pressure. We get it.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
not trying to say like, why haven't you finished? Like we're excited. We're supporting you. we're excited to see the folks that are doing this work just so smartly. And like I'm never gonna look at concerts today. I don't even go to very many of these concerts. I've been to like a Video Games Live.
Yeah.
So
Video games live. Yeah.
I would probably go to the chamber music ones. That's most likely to get me.
They're really good. So yeah, Eric is in charge of those, and like what is it? The Seymour's. I think it says Final Battle theme or whatever. It's like really, really excellent string quartet writing.
Yeah.
So it's like it's good stuff. It's good
I
stuff.
would definitely enjoy that as somebody who does a lot of string quartet adaptations. So
Mm-hmm.
that's definitely like my thing.
Yeah.
Game music concerts I find very, very strange.
Yeah.
That's maybe another stream, but
Yeah.
yeah, I guess my relationship to both like classical music and to gaming, there's there's kind of an uncanny valley for me at the. Does that make sense? Like there's something
Oh
bizarre
yeah,
about it that I can't quite put my finger on. That like it feels a bit off.
yeah.
At the same time, like I love that it happens. I just find as an maybe I'm just like not the right audience member for it sometimes. I am
Hmm.
very weird about like listening to the original versions over any sort of remix.
Arrangement or
So
yeah,
maybe there's just like I need to let go of the work, capital
yeah,
W work.
yeah.
But also it's I've never spent money on concerts in general.
Mm.
I'm not a live concert person. I have not been to very many like of anything.
That's a
Rock,
whole conversation
pop.
too, just like liveness and because a
Yeah.
lot of people want to valorize I have a chapter on this too, right? A lot of people want to valorize the liveness and be like, oh yeah, it's like it's always better live. It's like, is it really though? Like, don't get me wrong, it can be fun,
Sometimes it's
but
more experiential live, but
yeah,
sometimes its sound is not great in the hall, or there's other people in the hall that are making noise, or
yeah,
yeah, there's like all these other components. But also it's a financial thing. It's like man, concert tickets these days for
yeah.
anything,
Well, I mean,
because
yeah, with Ticketmaster just being horrible as well. I mean, that's definitely a whole other
and for some
stream,
artists
but
it's like that's where all the money is coming from, and yeah, that just the expense of it. It's like I end up having to really, really prioritize. Like if I go to a concert, it has to be something that's just absolutely unassailable for me. So
Back to the Future.
yeah, like I've never seen a lot of my favorite artists, like
Yeah,
Bjork. Why not?
Europe would be
I
cool.
bet she puts on an incredible show.
Yeah.
Like given her multimedia prowess. She just hasn't really been through the area at a time when I've been able to afford it. Like it has like all these things.
Yeah.
do
Well, you
these
should.
do these things even tour like anywhere near me, or am I making a whole trip out of going to like that's I know people that like drive across state lines and
Yes.
they go to another
Yeah.
place because it's like maybe coming to Chicago or something. So like
Hmm.
that's another piece of maybe why I haven't always seen a lot of these. I'm
Yeah.
not in like New York.
So if you want something really trippy, what you should try and find a showing of, or maybe you can just find a recording, is the Bjork by Bartok Symphony. This is a very recent thing. It is postmodernism at its peak, I guess is how I'll frame that. I haven't actually seen this one or seen slash heard this one in particular. I saw the Brahms by
Bartok v Bjork.
yeah, I saw the Brahms by oh I'm blanking now Radiohead one, which was very interesting, and there's also a
Oh,
Beethoven by Coldplay one. So
oh, fascinating.
yeah, I'm thinking about writing about those at some point.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah,
I have it pulled up so I could read more on this.
yeah,
Oh, wonderful. Well, this has been super fun, and I love that this gave me a little taste of some of the things about 10 by talking about the
yeah,
concerto, and then I was able to have a little bit of context for Andrew, who is going to give us the deepest dive on the hymn of the faith specifically, which of course is being used motivically in the concerto here. But we're going to look at it has a lot of settings in the when I even pulled up the soundtrack, I'm like, hymn of the faith, hymn of the faith, hymn of the faith. Like there's so many of them. So it's woven throughout the game in very different forms, and we're gonna take a very deep dive on that. And Andrew's gonna walk me through the things of 10 that I don't understand, uh, as somebody who ran away from the sphere grid. So that's next week, and then the week after, I have right now on the schedule. Fine, I guess I'll do my Bach article. So
yeah,
I guess that's what we'll do because I can't get anybody for the end of the month. So
yeah.
I think we'll finally do Bach, but I have to have somebody come on and like do it with me, so it's not just me talking about myself. I don't want to do that.
My students should do it. They actually really enjoyed that article.
Oh
So
man, oh
have my
man.
students lead this discussion. I'm sure they would love that.
Yeah. So if anybody wants to be my interlocutor for that, let me know. I feel like Karen would be really good for that if Karen was available. Like, just like knows the work decently well, and definitely has background in those areas. Like we could get into all her like organ stuff,
Yeah.
like the good organ, bad organ. Um, which we covered already. So that would be kind of a fun thing. But I don't know. I'll find somebody to serve as my foil. So I'm not talking to myself. I hate
Yeah.
doing my own stuff on this channel. It feels very like, haha, I'm giving kudos to myself.
Right.
But it's
Yeah.
also like a nice Hail Mary when nobody is like getting back to my emails. So and then once we hit things like the books, that gives me like time, because then I just figure out one time they can be on, and then I spend like weeks on the actual thing. So
Yeah.
this is why this is a nice thing to start doing. I didn't see what the poll ended up being.
It was definitely understanding video game music, absolutely, because
Okay,
that's what I
cool.
that's what I want to read.
Um,
I
I
actually
feel like it's actually been leaning that way overall, I think, because that one feels more foundational for a lot of people and maybe more broadly applicable. I do think that the Ocarina book is instructive in a meta sense of like, if you're going to do an entire book on one game and one soundtrack, here's how to do it. But I feel like understanding music is a little bit more on the surface. Like, we can apprehend how to use these tools and apply, and of course a lot of us do.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm happy to do either. So I'll keep asking, and I think it's leaning that way, but we have both that we can do. So and it's not like we can't do the other one later on. So
True.
these books exist.
Next summer.
Next summer, that would be really funny if I like do a summers thing every summer.
Yeah.
Like, I only have you on in the summer, Tim. That would be amazing. Thank you all for joining me. Thank you for spending so much time with me. I appreciate it. And we will see you all next week. I think next Thursday we're going to do some more Starlight streaming. We might do some more Wayward Strand. Probably won't do any more of the Duck Simulator, but I recommend it. It's $7 on Steam. If you need like just a vibe, get Placid Plastic Duck Simulator. It's awesome. But I think next week will be Wayward Strand on Thursday, and then Andrew Powell and FF10 on Friday. So enjoy your St. Patrick's Day and your wearing of the green things, whatever you do. Stay safe.
Yeah.
See you next week.